Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We're on page 1274. We started the new paragraph after explaining how halachas work, where their mila, their quality, even over Ava V'yira, based on what he brought from the Kuntus Achron from Tanya, that they actually manifest Chachmi law, the supernal wisdom of the divine, but it comes through the lavush of Ir HaNeshama, of Bri Yetzira, and passing through Asiya, so gives it also the body of being able to speak in the language, not just of Elikus and Yechudim, Elyonim, Eiris, and Shemus, and Serufim, and Partsufim, but the language of a world that where halacha applies, halachas that we need to govern our lives. So then with that, he went on to say, Kamoy Kain will understand Hamshachet through mitzvos. Because mitzvos too, remember, are drawing, mitzvos are not just the creation of existence, which is the divine as it manifests in creation, but mitzvos is God's will. That's what God wants us to do. Like he spoke earlier about the esrog, that when you hold an esrog on sukkahs and the dal minim and the minim and you shake it, you're actually manifesting, he said there, the actual divine chsadim elyonim of Zohav Atzilus, because that's the mitzvah the Eibishter wants you to do. So now he's going to explain how mitzvahs too carry a very powerful higher energy, and yet they also come into Dvarim Gashmim, physical things that we can relate to. And this is going to help us understand the questions he asked on page 1272 regarding the issue of reward and Gili Atzmi on one hand, the Pnimiyus Ha'er that mitzvahs reveal, and yet there's still levels, which we'll get back to, but that's where he's going with this. So now, as far as mitzvahs go, to explain it, he goes, the Ifan Hamshachas mitzvahs, he says, we learned earlier that mitzvahs are kalim, and now he's going to explain what that means. More detail. She says, Hini Yadua, mitzvahs are dependent, are tluyim ba'esis. They are connected with and relate to the letters of Havaya. Every mitzvah, that's why it's called mitzvahs Havaya or arches Havaya, the paths of Havaya. Like Krishma connects to the Eis Yud, Tefillin Eis Hey. I didn't have a chance to look up the sources for this. Maybe somebody looked it up. But it's definitely brought in Kabbalah and in different Svarim. And the same thing, every mitzvah has the letters that it connects with in the Yud Kei Vav Kei. So even though there are only 4 letters, but there are many configurations of these letters. And then he said, very name mitzvah itself is the letters of Yud Kei Vav Kei through the chiluf, the exchange of Adbash, where the Mem Sadik represents Yud Hey, and of course the last 2 letters in mitzvah Vav Hey is the Vav Hey. So you have Yud Kei Vav Kei, but the Yud Kei is exchanged for a Mem and a Tzadik. So now the question is, why? Why if mitzvahs are connected to Havaya, why is the first 2 letters, Mem Tzadik? He said, why does it actually come with an exchange of letters? What is the significance of that exchange? So now we're going to continue from there. So it's the line that begins, Yud Kei Bo b'mitzvah b'chilufe eisius. It's like 2/3 or 3/4 of the way down the page 1274. And it can be found at ayinbeis.com. So he's now going to answer that question. However, the inyan in this is, as I pointed out many times, Chassidus does not usually say question answer. It says, well, let's discuss the inyan. Once we know the inyan, automatically the question will be answered. It speaks about it much more as a more comprehensive way than just question answer. So what's the inyan? The inyan is bar le'il. It was explained earlier in the Maimer Dibra Maschel Ze Yitnu. He says that's in volume 2, page 870 and on. I'm looking down at the footnote. He says the Eisius Havaya, that the letters of Havaya are Pnimius Hein, Pnimius HaKelim. They're the level of Pnimius HaKelim. So we've discussed the difference between Chenis HaKelim and Pnimius HaKelim in a previous class. But let me just summarize it, reiterate it. In the physical sense, the pnimius of a keli is the inside of a cup, The Chitzenis HaKeli is the outside of the cup. Just to use a physical example. The inside of the cup, its primary role is to contain and hold whatever liquid or is inside that keli. So, for example, certain kelim are fitting to hold wine, and others will actually spoil the wine. So the Pnimis HaKeli has to be very fitting to be able to store and contain whatever is spilled, whatever is poured in there. The Chetzenis HaKeli's role is not to store or contain the energy, it's to mashpia, to transmit the wine. In other words, if you have a Pnimis HaKeli that's perfect, but it doesn't have a lip, or you can't hold on to it properly, then you won't be able to use it. The functionality, the Chetzenis HaKeli of us being able to hold it, to be able to drink from it, to be able to spill it, pour it to someone else, that's the Chetzenis HaKeli. So the Keli really has two parts to it. It's inner and outer. Basically, it's function. Both of them are the function, but it's relationship to what it's containing, and its relationship to what it's transmitting. So when you speak about Chetzenis and Pnimis HaKelim Lamaila, the Kelim are necessary because they're the very structure and identity of existence. But which part are we talking? The Pnimis HaKeli is far more focused on and subjugated and sublimated the bittul of the Pnimis HaKeli to the Oyer. So in many ways, the Pnimis HaKeli is far closer to the Oyer that's in it. Chetzenis HaKeli is how that Oyer is being nimshach to someone else. The example would be, for instance, when the difference between thought and speech. Your thought is a keli to your intelligence. You're now consciously thinking. With letters, it's a keli. It's a keli. It's the levush, the garment of thought, but it's a thought to yourself. So the nachshav is much closer to seichel. What about dibur? When you're speaking to someone, it's also kelim, but it's the kelim as they're bringing the idea to another. So they're going to have the oyer is going to be more concealed and less revealed because you're revealing it to another. So that would be an example of Pnimis and Chetzenis Kelim. So he says the asis of Shem Havaya is the asis of Havaya is the level of Pnimis HaKelim. So, for example, if you look at, let's say, the Kelim of Atzilus, so the Yudke Vovke in Chachma, Bina, Zoh, and Malchus, the Yudke, which is the letters Yudke Vovke, is the inner focus. What's their inner, their deeper purpose? And the Chetzenis HaKelim is their hashpah outward. Chachma's hashpah, Bina's hashpah outward. So he said Havaya relates to the Pnimis HaKelim, the inner intention, and of the Keli as it relates to the Oyer more. That's what he said. The Hagam, the Shem Havaya b'chinas Oyer, even though we know that Shem Havaya is a level of Oyer compared to other names, we know that Oyer K'neda, as it's known, B'kol Mokim b'chinas ha'esi is the Havaya and b'chinas HaKeli. So Havaya too has a level of Oyer, that's the message or the energy within Havaya, but the letters of Havaya are level of Kelim. But their levels actually Pnimis HaKelim. But they're an inner, more subtle form of Kelim as they relate more to the divine in a direct way. So for example, if you talk about, let's say, Shem Elikim, so there you could say that Shem Elikim, which is more the divine as it manifests within nature and existence, the Tzimtzum, Kelim, there you could say the focus is more on Chetzenis HaKelim, to create. Like we learned earlier, there's the energy of the divine as it relates to existence. There's the energy of the divine as it relates to what God wants from existence. So the Shem Havaya is what God wants from these Kelim. That would be the Pnimis HaKelim, the aces of Shem Havaya. V'zeu da aces hein moirim al efen havas v'amshachas ha'er. And this is what it means when we say aces. What is the union of letters? They indicate on the manner of how the energy is transmitted and carried forth. Because if the energy is like, think of it energy, but there's the pipes or the channels through which the energy travels. The aces are those channels. So Zeh begins Keli Levush. That the way you carry the energy, the way the air is carried is through a container and a garment. Here he's using them both interchangeably, so they're basically the same idea. It's traveling through something. If you don't have kelim, the iris can be very much scattered everywhere, or they're in a way that they're not contained and channeled anywhere. So in other words, the asis of Havaya channel the Pnimis HaKelim channel the air that Havaya is representing, is transmitting. V'hainu, and that means, and that is B'chinas Pnimis HaKeli, Shemetayet Umegala Sa'er. Because what's the role of the Pnimis HaKeli? That's the role of the Pnimis HaKeli. Shemetayet, it describes and gives shape and reveals the energy. That's what ACs do. The ACs do. These letters are revealing and shaping the energy that's flowing through them. As I said before, Chitzenis HaKeli is not to shape the energy or to reveal it. It's to transmit it to the next level. So Pnimis HaKeli does that. V'hainu, Pnimis HaKeli shemetayir megala sa'er. Right. Now, Shem Havaya itself is now going to break down, has many different ways that it can express itself. There's Havaya in its pure form, but as we're going to learn, we also learned, of course, Shem Ma, Ban, Sag, Ma, Sag and Ab are the four different ways that you, the Miluyim of the Yud Ke Vav Ke, when you spell them out, they add up to 45, to 52, to 63 or 72. But there's also how Havaya is written. And that's what he's going to say now. Uprote Shem is Havaya. Now Havaya further breaks down. There's different ways that name is expressed. Hein besfiris protis. So the spheres protis, each one expresses Havaya in a different way. Kamoi, Shem Havaya benikud patach, hu b'chochma, b'china Shem Ab. That Shem Havaya benikud patach, which I think he means Havaya. Yeah, that Yud Ke Vav Ke, when you write them with a patach, which is so I can't pronounce it because you're not supposed to pronounce it. But if you put a patach under the yud, under the hey, under the vav, you have a certain way of pronouncing it. You could also pronounce it with a kometz, ya or ya. So basically, as I said, I'm not pronouncing all the four letters, but the different punctuation marks that we use, a kometz, a patach, that tell you how to read the word. And there are different ways you can read a word. For example, the word erev can be read erev, it can be read orav. So there's different ways to pronounce. So Havaya, the pronunciations and their miluyim, which means when you add up the numbers. So he says, so nikud patach, which is chachma, that's the level of Shem Ab. Then the Havaya is written out with yud K, yud hey yud, vav yud vav, I believe, and hey yud, or maybe vav vav. Adds up to 72. It's called b'milui yudin. So it's the milui, and there's the pata, the nukudis. The nukudis tell you how to pronounce it. The milui tells you how to add up the numbers. And these are different configurations of Havaya as they manifest the divine energy. So in Chachma, Havaya is one expression. Ubenikud Seirei is A. Like if Aleph, Kometz Aleph is A, Patach Aleph is A, Seirei is A. The same Aleph can be pronounced all these three ways. So Patach A, Yud Ke Vav Ke Patach is in Chachma. When you say Havaya with the Nikud of Seirei, Bebina, that's in Bina, A. So A is in Chachma, A is in Bina. So like Yeh, Hey, you'd say Yeh, Hey, like that in Yud Ke Vav Ke. In Patach, you'd say Ya, Ha, and so on. Whereas, so that's Seder Bina V'hi, Shem Sag. There you go by Sag, which is the Mili Heyin, where the Hey is written with a Hey, Hey, not a Hey Yud. Ubenikud Segel, B'chesed, Segel is Eh. So fourth pronunciation is A, Eh. So when you say Yud Ke Vav Ke, it could also be Yeh, He. And that Segel is what? He says in Chesed. Which I believe, I don't know if it's connected to Ban. He doesn't mention it. He only mentions Ab and Sag. But what you're seeing here is different ways that Havaya is expressed, which is different ways that this Eris and Kalim and Pnimis HaKelim are manifesting. Ukiyadua b'kavonis the Shem Havaya, b'chai brachas the Shemoneh Esrei. As it's known in the intention of what the kavana we make, what intention do we have in the Shem Havaya, in this 18 blessings of Shemoneh Esrei. So Shemona Esrei we say 18 times Havaya. Baruch Atah Hashem, Baruch Atah Havaya. As it's explained at length in the mimer that he mentions, Zeh Yitnu. So there, based on this is based on Pri Eitz Chaim probably, on Shar Kavonis from the Arizal, which talks about the different intentions. So Havaya can have different ways that you express it and different Kavonis intentions that we use as we're drawing the energy down through these names of Havaya. So they're all a Shem Havaya, but now he's broken it down. And he's going to soon come back and say why a mitzvah, the connection to mitzvahs. Anybody want to ask anything about what we've just finished learning right now? It's not finished yet, but this little section here.
Why is Pata Chochma and Tzeirei Bina?
That you'll have to look up in the sources, the mimer that he refers to, and the sources. Doesn't explain it here, and I don't recall, so I would suggest looking it up if you really want to know.
And Rabbi Jacobson, if anybody wants to know what they are, that you could look up a Sephardic Siddur, and in the Shemona Esrei, it shows exactly the Yud Kei Vav Kei with all the stuff that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's true. And it's also in the Arizal Siddur. You have all these details. Agreed, that's right. Yeah. But there are places where you can find exactly why these Nekudis, what they all mean. Generally speaking, yeah. I think Kometz is Keser, Patach is Chochmeh, Seira is Bina, and now he said Segel is Chesed. All the Nekudas have different spheres and explains why each one. Yeah, it's also in Pardes. You may be able to find it also. If you look, I think in Sefer Alakutim from the Tzemach Tzedek, in the entry called Nekudas, Protea Nekudas, he talks about this as well. Okay. But Inyan Hu, and the Inyan of this is Ki Yadua, the whole shame, it's known that every name, Hainu Kasher Ba, Ha'er B'tzirufi Esis HaMagbilim, which means as the air manifests in the different combinations and configurations of the letters that are that magbil, that channel and define the idea. So let me spell it out specifically. I always point out Iris and Kalim are like ideas and the letters either of thought, speech, or writing. So we're right now reading Ayin Beis. We're reading letters. The letters, however, are not just empty letters. They're conveying an idea. The idea they're conveying is the Oyer. But without the Tzirufi Esis, if you didn't have them broken down in structured letters and words, we would not be able to understand this Oyer. There would be no way that the teacher, in this case the Rebbe Rashab, would be able to convey to us if he didn't express it either in speech, which he did when he delivered the Maimorim, or in writing, which is what we're learning right now. So letters are really what's called Esis from the word Osa Boiker. They channel. They're channelers. Like I pointed out many times, like you look at a projector of white light. You project white light on a screen. All you see is white light. You put a film in front of the light. The film could be letters, it could be images, and suddenly you see projected on the screen images, letters, and so on, and images. So the letters are essentially the kalim that transmit the oir. But in the letters themselves, we learn primis hakeli rather, is the inner dimension that has the letter, is the right letters that are expressing the idea well, meaning they're containers, I shouldn't say expressing, that they are fitting to the idea. Like you'll see some people, one person conveys an idea very clearly. So what he's doing is, first of all, the letters that he's chosen, the words he's chosen are very fitting to the idea that he's expressing. And he also has the chitzenius hakeli, he knows how to express it well to the audience. So two things are happening. He knows the idea well, and he knows how to find the right words for it, and also the right words that express it to the audience. Shem Havaya are these letters that convey the oir of Havaya, but in a way, the primis hakelim of the letters, they do it in a perfect way that they are perfect for this oir that they're transmitting. So the letters of Havaya with the patach, like he said, is transmitting the oir of Chachma. The letters with a tzere is transmitting the energy of Bina, Segel, Chesed. So each one, the letters are doing that role. So he's explaining now That's, every name, which the name comes, the energy is being transmitted or coming, arriving, or being transmitted through the configurations, the combinations of these letters that are defining the idea, the energy. The inyan Hashem hu shemitayir umagdal sadover. That's the purpose of a name. When you give a name to something, it's describing mitayir and defining the thing that it's naming. Same thing with the letters. U'kamoshn is barliel, as was explained earlier. That the air is coming in a form of transmission and descent, al kaponim, some form of descent at least. That's when it manifests in these names and in these configurations or combinations. In other words, if the air is on its own, before it arrives into any way that's transmitted and descending, it's higher than letters. As soon as you have letters, you mean the air has come down a level to be able to be channeled and expressed. It's not just white light. It's not just shapeless. It's being expressed in these channels called the letters. However, now, chitzenius hakelim hainu b'shem elikim v'chem b'shem keil v'tzvos. The outer containers, which is the letters of the name Elikim, and the same thing with the other names, Keil, Tzvos. He's just mentioning 3 outside of Havaya. There's others as well, the Shaddai. But he's mentioning these 3. So this is Chitzenius HaKelim. U'Primus HaKelim hu b'shem Havaya. So when you talk about what's the difference, he says in Sfarim, in Halacha, Shem Havaya is unique among all the 7 names you're not allowed to erase. It's called the Shema Etzem, Shema Mefurish. That's what Havaya is, the name that was said in the Kodesh Kodashim by the Kohen Gadol. It's called Shema Etzem, Shema Mefurish, and Shema Meyuchad. These are 3 names given to Shema Havaya. The Tetragrammaton, it has a unique role. When you talk about Shema Havaya, it's higher than the other names. The other names are more functional names. Elikim is the name that God uses when he's in a state of din, the tzimtzum, mishpat. The name Tzvos is when God is in a state of warrior. The name Keil is when God is bestowing chesed. It's connected to chesed. Havaya is considered the general revelation of the divine. So Havaya is a higher name. So he says that Havaya refers to Primus HaKelim, whereas the letters of Elikim, Keil, and Tzvos and the other names is Chitzenius HaKelim. Now, v'hine, and now, b'shem Havaya atzmai, yesh gam ken primis v'chitzenius. In Havaya itself, you also have an inner and an outer. Who? And this is now, is going top of page 1275. And that's the difference, who I have for is by Yud-K Levov-K. So Yud-K, the name Havaya divides into 2, Yud-K Vov-K. So he says that's the difference. The Yud-K is the primis of Havaya, and Vov-K in Havaya itself is Chitzenius. The Hini Yadua, because now it's known. In his Bar Le'il, and it was also explained above. The 4 letters of Havaya are key to all transmission because they consist of a Yud, which is a concentration at Tzimtzum. It's a concentration. So when you take something and you want to transmit it to a lower level, you need to first concentrate it. That's Chochmah. Then that concentrated point expands in the Hey, which is Bina. Then it travels through the Vav, which is like a line that transmits to the recipient. And then the recipient, the Malchus, is the last Hey. So Vav is Zah, the Midas. And the last Hey is the recipient, and there expands again, but now in the Klei HaMakabel, in the recipient. Just to give another example, the Baal Shem Tov says, Nosen Titen, that when it gives tzedakah, when you give tzedakah, the very act of tzedakah, giving tzedakah, is the Yud Kei Vav Kei. The Yud is the coin, the Hey is the 5 fingers, the hand of the giver, the Vav is the stretched out hand to the recipient, and the last Hey is the recipient's 5 fingers and hand receiving the coin. So Yud Kei Vav Kei. So now, so that's how Havaya works. Those four. The Yud, hu b'chinas tzimtzum. Yud is a concentrated dot, tzimtzum. V'hei is pashtus, erich v'rechev. Hey is an expansion, length and width. V'hainu esis yudke, the chachma bina. That's the letters of yudke of chachma and bina. Chachma is the yud, bina is the hey. The esis is vavke, and the letters vavke goes like this: hamshacha bevav shem b'chinas midas shebelev. Vav, like hamshacha, is like a line that transmits. It's like a channel that transmits. That's the level of the midas, the emotions in the heart. And finally, the fourth letter, v'ispashtus b'mekabel b'hei achreina b'dibur. And the hispashtus, the expansion by the recipient, is the last hey, the second and the last hey in the Yudke Vavke. B'dibur, here he's saying, is the speech of the mashpia as he speaks to Malchus, to the recipient. But it sometimes refers to the recipient receiving. But bottom line, it's an expansion, but not the expansion of the original point of the mashpia. Now it's hispashtus, the hey, the second hey, is the expansion as it is by the recipient, the dibur. The nimtza. So what do we find from this? What do we derive from this? That tzimtzum hispashtus, the yudke hanu adayim b'mashpia. That the tzimtzum and hispashtus, the concentration and the condensation of the idea, and hispashtus and its expansion of yudke, that's still in the mashpia. That's all happening on the mashpia level. Mashpia concentrates idea, then he expands it in a hey. I'll read the parentheses. It's a few lines. However, even though it's talking the mashpia, but it's not completely on the mashpia on his own. Is how he's preparing himself in order for the purpose of transmitting it to someone. But it's still the first two stages within the teacher, so to speak, within the transmitter. V'hainu the essence spheres that Atzilus b'chlolos hem b'chinas memutza b'nei ein sof lebiyah. Commission is bar le'el be'erech. We learned at length earlier that the 10 spheres of Atzilus in general are an interface between ein sof lebiyah, the divine infinite that's higher than Atzilus, and biyah, which is the creation of Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya. So Atzilus serves as an interface, as we learned at length earlier. It's a big theme, of course, Ayin Beis interface, but especially about Atzilus. And in this interface itself, P'chinas Yudke hu b'mashpia dayin. Yudke is still within the mashpia, in the interface, it's still on the level of the transmitter, the mashpia. Shezeyin hanistoris. That's called the level of hanistoris. It says, hanistoris laHashem, liyudke. And then it says, v'niglas lonu lebneinu. So Yudke is Yudke hanistoris. It's still the concealed, because it's concealed within the mashpia, even though he's already preparing himself to transmit, but it's still within him. And the root of roots in the energy, in the infinite energy before the tzimtzum, it's in general the air before the tzimtzum. The klolos. It's the level of shmoi, because we're talking about Havaya. Shmoi, as it is hayahu shmei bilvad before the tzimtzum, that this is called Atzilus, the klolos, Atzilus in macrocosm. So what he is explaining here is, which is this parenthesis really connects it to the entire theme of Ayin Beis, that this transmission of Yudke Vavke has two sides to it. One is how the mashpia is preparing himself to go downward, and that's in general that's the Chachma and Bina of Atzilus, and that is that's still the level of an Istaris in mashpia. In its root of roots, it's the Shmoi, Hayahu Shmoi Bilvad, the Shmoi as it is before the Tzimtzum, as we discussed earlier when he spoke about Shmoi. That was when he talked about the Eris and Kalim, that the Kalim are rooted higher than the He spoke about it earlier. But that's not the point here about Kalim, even though he is talking about Kalim of Yudke, Vavke. Okay, that's Yudke. How about Vavke? So now he goes after the parentheses. Aval Vavke, hu yiridus hashefa lemekabel. The Yudke Vavke, the Vavke is now the descending and the drawing down of the flow to the recipient. So in a way, using the example of a teacher and a student, Yud-K is when the teacher is preparing and priming himself. He concentrates his idea. He then expands it in ways that he can now express it. And then comes the actual transmission. That's the Vav-K. He's transmitting it, Yeridas HaShefel and Makabel. It's actually coming down. So based on this, we'll understand why Havaya has a Pnimius and a Chetzenius. Imkein Eishis Yud-K B'chinas HaPnimius. So the letters of Yud-K is the inner dimension of Havaya. Taram Shanimshach L'Makabel. Prior to it being transmitted to the recipient, the Eishi is Vav-K, and the letters of Vav-K, Hu Hanimshach M'B'chinas Kelim L'Makablim. There, it's actually the transmission from the containers to the recipients. Remember, we said Chetzenius HaKeli is when you drink the wine or you pour it to someone. Pnimius HaKeli is when the Keli is receiving the Ur. So the Yud-K is the Pnimius HaKeli of in Havaya, that's receiving the divine energy that's being transmitted. That's Chachma Bina Hanastaris, still within the Mashpia. And then comes the next step, is Vav-K, is when the Chetzenius HaKelim come and they actually transmit it to the recipient. And that is Hanimshach B'chinas Kelim Makablim. And what is that in the Shadish? Since you gave the Shadish of Yud-K, what's the Shadish of this? B'sharshan Be'erin Sof, Hu B'shem Havaya Sheba'er Shalifnei HaTzemtzum, Shezeu B'chinas. And so he goes back and says in the root of the Erin Sof, the B'sharshan Be'erin Sof, it's Shem Havaya that's in the air before the Tzimtzum. We said before, Atzil is the Klolos, but that itself, the B'chinas Yud-K, Hu B'chinas Er HaMeir La'atzmei, now he's breaking it down. Before he just said it in general. Yeah, okay. It's the air that radiates to himself. Who Kedem Alei Saratzen? This prior to his arising in his will. Remember, before God actually desired existence in an actual conscious desire, first everything was still energy that as it relates to the God himself. Ubchinas Vavke umashameir la'atzmei b'chinas eir hashayach la'elamis. It's also radiating to himself, but he's now already considering and thinking, and the eir shayach la'elamis, which is the level of alei saratzen. He's going to bring a bunch of mamorim now. Like we learned earlier, the Maimer Ba'aleischa HaGimel, that's in volume 2. That's in volume 1, right in the beginning. So Zeu Shedish Ben Sevav Kalamin Umamala Kalam. Below they say maybe it should say Shedish Bechinas Sevav Kalam. But it could be that's the difference. And the root, Sevav Kalam, Mamala Kalam, Sevav Kalam is rooted in the divine as he relates to himself. Malcolm is rooted as the divine in himself, but as he's relating to another. And it's explained at length in the discourse of Samach Vav, Rosh Hashanah, the Hemshech of Rosh Hashanah Samach Vav. That's the famous Samach Vav. So he hasn't yet explained why mitzvah Mem Tzadik is Vav K, but he's laying the ground for that. So far what we've learned is now, is Yud-K Vav-K is the Pnimis HaChetzenius in Havaya itself. Havaya in general is Pnimis HaKelim, the Oisius of Havaya, whereas the other names are Chetzenius HaKelim, but in Havaya itself, Yud-K Vav-K is like two dimensions of the divine as it relates to, is within the Mashpia. It's still the Tzedach HaShpah, like he said, still for the purpose of Hashpah, but it's still within the Mashpia, and then how the mashpia within himself is relating to the recipient. So that's the difference between Yud-K, Vav-K, and also explain what letters are in general. They are the transmitters of Ur. So, but since we finished the paragraph, let me stop here if anybody wants to ask anything. Okay, so now he continues. Since mitzvahs relate to Havaya, let's go back to what he said. Mitzvahs are containers. They're the letter connected to the letters of Havaya. So just like in Havaya, there's Yud-K Vav-K, he says, but mitzvahs, shem b'chinas hakelim, mitzvahs, which is the level of the containers. Hainu b'chinas eisius Havaya. That means as we said, the containers within the letters of Yud-K Vav-K. Hariyesh b'zeh gamken beis madreges hanal. In mitzvahs, you also have these two levels. The above mentioned levels, Bechinas Yud-K, Vav-K. The beginnis Yud K, the level of Yud K and the level of Vav K. The beginnis Yud K, who beginnis Helem ba'atzmei adayim. The level of Yud K Mitzvos is still a concealment within himself. The Vav K, who beginnis Gagili. And Vav K is a level of revelation. Okay, let me read the parentheses. Why not? V'agam, and even though the Seder Havaya Se'er b'chinas Simsim V'Spashtus Hu b'chinas Chetzeni Se'er, and even though he's asking a question qualifying that the order of drawing the energy in a form of Simsim and Ispashtus, like Yud K, is Hu b'chinas Chetzeni Se'er. It's in the outer dimension of it. So now he's asking a question or qualifying. Till now you're telling me the Yud K is Pnimius and Vav K is Chetzenius. But the fact of the matter is Yud K too, it's all coming to transmit. We're not talking about Pnimius, how it is really in the deepest levels above. Even the Yud K is also, Yud is the concentration of the Mashpia. His Pashtus is the Bina that expands it. He says that's also Chetzeni Se'er, which needs to have measure, Mido or Mishkal, a measure and definitions of how to transmit the energy. So Yud K is also part of the transmission. It's true, it's still within the Mashpia, but you can't call it Mamish Pnimius Se'er, that's beyond everything. So he says like this, Mashenke b'b'chinas b'pnimius v'atzma Se'er. Whereas in Pnimius, the inner and core of energy, you don't have this level of Yud, hey, the Tzimtzum and Ispashtus and so on. But Kol Mokim, nevertheless, Harigam B'zeh Yesh Medida. One minute. Nevertheless, he says, even in Pnimius Ha'er, there's also an element of measure. That's what he says. The ikar medida bezeh hu be'ezeh eifin yiskabel, and the main measure here is not in the actual transmission, but he says, in what form will this energy be received? Ukamoi, here we go. Ukamoi amro dalet pa'amim shenemar oz Rav Yisapra ad vayemer ela adam ukamashkos v'makamach. So first I thought he meant what it says in the Gemara, that when you say something in public, you should repeat it to yourself 4 times. I think he's not referring to that. I think this is regarding Oz Rav Yisapra. Is that the story, the Parshas Seita? I have to look up what he's referring to, but he's referring to that even in the earliest levels, you already have a form of preparation of how it will be received before you relate. I have to look up what he's referring to be honest. I'm not sure.
It's an Eov.
Can I ask a question?
One second.
It's an Eov.
The verse is an Eov?
Yep.
You see context there, what the context is?
1 second. It says Azra v'Yisapra Ichina Gam v'Chakara.
Yeah.
It doesn't put the broader context. I'll have to look up Eov.
No, I'm familiar with the context is. It's essentially that when you report and bearing witness, you have to go through a whole process. But I want to see inside. I'll look it up inside. Basically, he wants to explain that even when we're talking about the highest levels of Pnimius Ha'er, there is also an element of measure. Rakshehi, let me finish the parentheses, then I'll take questions. Rakshehi medida atzmius. However, there, it's not measure as an actual measuring, like you're measuring the Eir, how it should actually be transmitted, what letters you use. There it's a medida atzmius. On the core level, it's a fundamental form of measure. Ha'atzmi nimdad That the Atzmi itself is so-called measuring himself. So it's not a measure in the context of real gvul. It's like in the level of bli gvul, it itself is measuring. I need to look up more about how to explain that, but it's something we've learned already. Medida Atzmis is the difference between actual defined parameters or how the Atzmi is beginning to define himself as he wants to manifest in parameters.
There's
That's a general explanation for it. So
Maybe it's
so
from
there-
the Alter Rebbe.
hold on. Let me finish. So therefore, there also is a level of Helam and Gili. This is very relevant to what we learned before about Atzmi going through levels. But actually, Medida Atzmis, I will look up more of this to be able to explain it. But the point, the bottom line, what he wants to say is that even the Yudke Vavke, even though, yes, it's true, there's an element of Chetzenis air, which needs to have measure exactly how it should flow, but there's also a measure that's necessary even in higher levels, that is not a measure of how much it should flow, but the higher levels are so-called allocating resources in the sense of determining in the very core level what measure of how it will be received, as opposed to the actual transmission. It's something like the where he says, Shiur Atzme B'koyach. I think he's referring to levels like that, or even higher than that, where you're allocating and you're envisioning what will come, and within yourself, you're allocating resources, as opposed to the actual transmission, when a teacher is actually transmitting, and then it comes into real defined parameters. I believe that's what he's saying here. But anyway,
You're right.
Can I
I
ask you?
think that it's talking here about the Alter Rebbe.
one person at a time. Who's
There's a number of midrashim.
What about the
that say
Vav?
what you just said.
one second. There are three people who want to speak: Yitzchak, Shleima, and Tzvi. Start Yitzchak, since you go ahead.
I'm just saying, there's a number of midrashim that said exactly what you just said, that it's the way God measures what he wants to do before he does it.
Yeah, that's the idea. But I want to see
Like
it
in the
inside.
process of creation.
Right.
Yeah, for that reason, I would suggest that maybe the Vav K came before the Yud K. I mean, because he wants to know he wants it. The first thing he thinks of is what he wants to transmit, and then he knows how much to bring himself to etzem and what to give. But the ultimate thing is, in that case, he wants transmit. You would think it would be Vav K, Yud K in that case.
He's not saying that here, so I wouldn't go there right now. That's another discussion right now. Let's first try to understand what he is saying. Right now, he's saying that the Yud K is in the Mashpia, and there's a level that is connected to Chetzeni Yisrael, but there's a level that's within himself, he's already allocating measuring. Go ahead, Rab Shlomo, what do you want?
In Likutei Torah, Daf Nun Gimel, the first Amor, the Alter Rebbe is talking about the Tzimtzum.
Likutei what? What did you say? Likutei
Daf Nun Gimel Aleph in Vayikol.
Yeah, what about it?
The Alter Rebbe brings there about Tzimtzum in his Talik, he says a Dibur, and he says a Machshava ganz Arichos, and then he brings in the Parashas Rabbi's Tiso, Omro Dalet Pa'omim Beinoi Levein Atzmoi, Harei Shayach Amiro Beinoi Levein Atzmoi. Omro Vayesapro until Vayomer Alo Odom. That this is what he wants to say here, that even in the Yud-K, which is in the highest level, it's also Shayach to say that there is Beinoi Levein Atzmoi, there is an Amiro. That's how I think.
That's what I said, that I thought he meant Beinei Ben Atzmei, but I wanted to look it up exactly what the Pasuk, how it relates to the Pasuk. But correct, that's correct. It's all within himself, as Yitzchak said. Oh, it's all within himself, not. But you have to understand, even Yud-Kei Chitzeni Se'er is also within himself, and even Vav-Kei is within himself. But it's as it relates to the Makabel, like he said. So there's a lot of levels within himself. There's within himself, completely within himself. There's within himself as he's beginning the transmission to the other, and then there's within himself as he's identifying what exactly the other is receiving. So I think there's all the levels here. We'll go over it again, but I wanted to just, okay, good. And from this, he's going to continue. We're going to stop here, middle of page 1275. But from here, he's going to continue to explain why by mitzvah, the Yud K is concealed in the Mem Tzadik. That's going to be the next thing when he continue speaking about the two levels of mitzvahs that he's addressing now. Okay, listen. We're getting through it, right?
Yeah, because he asked that in Pnimius v'atzmos ha'oil, there is no medida. But he said, Mikol mokom harei gam bo ze yesh medida.
Correct. And the ikar is eza eifin yiskabel. That's the key. In other words, it's not thinking about how to transmit, but you're thinking about the makabel. How will they receive what you're going to say? Yeah. So
and
within you,
Dalet Pa'amim is Ro Vayesapro until Vayemer Al Adam, which is coming begilui to the Mushpa.
That's the meaning. Okay. So first you look, and then you
Amro Beinu Levein Atzmoi.
Is that the Maimer Lahavan in your Mashakasu Beitzus Chaim that you're looking at in Likutei Torah?
I don't know how the Maimer is starting, but it's in Vayikro. Don't give him an Aleph. He's talking there about the symptoms. He says Hadibur.
How did you just know it from memory, or how'd you find it?
No, I just saw it in Google.
Oh,
ChabadLibrary.org.
Got it. Okay, we're going to stop here at the end of the parentheses, the middle of page 1275.